Well, welcome back, Anagenesis. Daniel Napier here. This is our second video meditating on the book of Proverbs. We're in chapter 1, and we'll focus on verses 8 through 19 here in just a little bit. But what I want us to do is begin with a broader kind of overview of what are wisdom and folly. You remember that last time we saw that it's only through acknowledging that God's active power is in proximity to us. It's right here where we're at. In other words, fear of the Lord. It's only through fear of the Lord that we're enabled to interact with things as they really are. In other words, come to know. And that acknowledgement of God's active presence then is the disposition out of which the whole good life flows. Now, Proverbs has a name for that disposition or kind of collection of skill sets that produce the good life. And it also has a name for that set of dispositions and unskilled behaviors, thought processes and behaviors that produce individual and communal ruin. Those words are important, and that's what we're going to focus on today. The words are wisdom and folly, or foolishness. So, what is wisdom? Wisdom refers to the life skills and the dispositions at the level of habit that produce a fruitful order within this world. Okay? So wisdom is that cluster of dispositions and skills that enables us to live in such a way that life becomes orderly, and through that order, good things follow. Fruit and benefits for ourselves and others naturally follow. Now, in the book of Proverbs, there's an insistence that this wisdom, this life skill, is rooted in a deeper skill, a deeper wisdom that is actually the wisdom by which God created this world. In other words, human wisdom is rooted in and it's modeled after the kind of skill that God used when he fashioned this world. And so in order to understand what we're aiming at in our own lives, we have to think a little bit about the way in which God went about shaping this world to be a livable place for us. Now, part of what we see in the book of Proverbs, and this correlates with what we see in the opening chapters of Genesis, is that there's a deep structure that God has placed when he made this world that underlies, it goes beneath, or it stands behind all of the surface particularities. The vast variety of things that God has made are kind of held together by underlying unifying principles. And so what at initial glance out in the world just looks random and unrelated and perhaps chaotic because there's so many different things interacting, to the patient and understanding gaze, that world begins to yield a background order that begins to shine through. It becomes visible through all the particulars of the world. And so at first blush, it may look chaotic, like just one more thing after another, but to the eyes of wisdom, the underlying principles kind of come to the surface, and you can see the connections. Now, it's instructive in order to see that deep structure, to go back and think of what we see in Genesis chapter 1. Because in Genesis 1, there are phases to the way in which God goes about producing the world. And so order in creation and then fruitfulness of creation come in stages that reveal an order of how things must progress. And so it's interesting. You open in chapter 1 of Genesis with God giving existence to the whole. So in the beginning there's God, and God creates. He gives existence to the heavens and the earth. You have the whole, but it's this kind of jumbled mess to start with. In other words, things are indistinct. It's not a livable whole where one could find one's way within and be fruitful because everything is undifferentiated. And so then the days of creation begin with a process of God making separations or distinctions and then naming those things that have been separated. And so God creates order by separating. And so, for instance, he starts by separating light from darkness. And then he gives name, night and day. And then he separates with a firm, kind of a firm boundary, waters above from waters below. And then he gives names to this. You've got the sky, the heavens is what he names, the firmament. And then he separates out. He gathers dry land into one place and the waters in another. And then he gives a name, earth and sea. And so he goes about separating and naming to create a deep structure of order. And that happens before then the third wave. You can think about those names and separations as being the roots of order. But then the third wave is when those are made then, those distinct items within creation are made fruitful. And so having separated things out, he then calls for the land as a separate distinct thing now put in order to first bring forth and produce out of it vegetation, and then later to produce land animals that come out of this earlier distinct creation called dry land, earth. And he does something similar with the sea, producing sea creatures and the birds and so forth. And so what we see here is a pattern. The pattern is roots before fruits. In other words, there's the establishment first of these underlying conditions of a well-ordered environment that must happen first, so that then second, growth, flourishing can emerge out of that underlying order. Roots always must come before fruits. You can find fruitfulness only as something that follows, never as something that precedes establishing the proper conditions. Now, that's important because it's also true of human life and of the ordering of our own existence. There are deep patterns, there are orders that must be in place for a human life before that person and this is also true of communities, before persons and communities can become fruitful and life-giving growth can emerge. And so it's important that those deep structures, the distinctions and the names that form the roots of a well-lived life, these are moral and practical skills. You could think about them as personal, habit-rooted perimeters for thought and behavior that have to be established within ourselves before a life of effectiveness can follow, before we begin to have communal influence, before we find that we're capable of producing sufficient resources to take care not just of ourselves, but of other people around us in relation to us, before we're able to live out of this kind of well-being that becomes communicable, becomes infectious, so that shalom, well-being, peace passes from ourselves to those around us within a community. And so the order is important. First, the moral and practical skills for living that are the roots, and later the fruit will follow naturally. So what are the kind of roots, that deep structure of order in human life by which we mirror God's skill in creating the world? Well, there's a host of things that come together here, but they're all related to each other. The first and the central one we talked about last time, which is this awareness of God's presence and God's activity right here, right now, that God's power is in proximity. And then out of that come a host of personal virtues, things like proper attention or awareness, truthfulness, a readiness to listen to others so as to learn, and to counterbalance any tendency within ourselves to self-deception. Thinking of virtues like industriousness and generosity, things like benevolence within a community setting. All of these are the personal distinctions and concepts, the separations and names that must be established within a human life before flourishing begins to just naturally follow. Now, all of that as a whole, as well as many others that are linked together, but as an organic whole, that deep order to life is what we call wisdom. It's life skills that underlie fruitful existence, fruitful life. There's also a word for its contrary, and that's the word folly. Folly is a way of describing a variety of unskilled, clumsy approaches to life that produce ruin. Ruin for the individual as well as ruin for the community, for those who have the misfortune of living together with the person who's pursuing folly, pursuing foolishness. Now, there are a great variety of mistaken approaches to life because folly is a kind of shallowness. It's a living on the surface instead of seeking to go deeper into the roots, into the deep structure of how we're put together and the world is put together. Because of that, there's always going to be a vast variety of ways to be foolish. But that shallow life can be described in terms of having four major kind of mistaken life approaches. And so there's four major life mistakes, four predictable common forms of shallowness that the book of Proverbs focuses on in order to warn us from them and to call us beyond to a deeper life of wisdom. Now these four are can be thought of in terms of two mistaken goals and two mistaken means or instruments. The two mistaken goals are to pursue money and sex as ends in and of themselves. Okay? And the two mistaken means are to pursue the various goals that we have in life through violence and deceit. Okay? And both of these are mistakes because they aim at something too shallow. Okay? Money and sex as the two mistaken goals are life mistakes because of their shallowness. It's not that money and sex are bad. In fact, both money and sex are good in their own place. But they're only good when they come as kind of the natural byproduct, the overflow of pursuing something larger, something deeper. Likewise, the mistaken means of violence and of deceit or falsehood, these are shallow strategies for life, and what they together are they are ways of trying to circumvent the natural order of things, to speed up results. Put it this way, they're attempts to get the fruit without developing the root. Now, as such, these lead to ruin, and two of these are depicted in this passage that we'll look at right now. And I'm just going to read it. I think I've said enough for you to hear and understand. Here's the warning. I'll begin in verse 10 with the warnings, then we'll come back and we'll hear how it begins. My son, if sinners entice you, do not consent. If they say, come with us, let us lie in wait for blood, let us ambush the innocent without cause, let us swallow them alive like Sheol, even whole as those who go down to the pit. So this is the mistaken means of violence. Okay? And now it's going to tie it to the mistaken goal that's focused in this passage. We shall find all kinds of precious wealth. It's money for its own sake, right? We shall find all kinds of precious wealth. We shall fill our houses with spoil. Throw in your lot with us. We shall all have one purse. My son, do not walk in the way with them. Keep your feet from their path, for their feet run to evil. They hasten to shed blood. And now notice the end of these shallow pursuits. He says, indeed, it's useless to spread a net in the eyes of any bird, but they lie in wait for their own blood. They ambush their own lives. So are the ways of everyone who gains through violence. It takes away the life of its possessor. So that's the warning. Here we're warned concerning especially pursuing money for its own sake and using violence as the means to obtain it. In later passages, we'll see sex emerge as an improper goal, and we'll see deceit as an improper means. But for now, let's go back as we finish this to verses 8 and 9 and hear how this section begins, because it's an invitation. It's an invitation. Hear, my son, your father's instruction, and do not forsake your mother's teaching. Indeed, they're a graceful wreath to your head, and they are ornaments about your neck. What you and I have been given as we open the book of Proverbs, as we take this time to stop and reflect upon it, we've been given the advantage of wise counsel, of life instruction. And what it's doing is it's calling us to think more deeply, to approach life in terms of the deep structure that God made, and putting in place the virtues that are roots out of which a fruitful life could follow. Let me just say that this life that is offered, the life of wisdom, the life lived in keeping with God's own structuring of this world, this is a life for you, and it is a life for me. It's possible. We can have it. And so today, we're invited. Let's go further up. Let's go deeper in. And let's pursue together the life for which you and I were created. Grace and peace.